Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So in this installment of the After the Collapse series, we're going to discuss 10 different strategies that you can utilize in order to survive a post-grid down situation in an urban environment. So let's get to it. Don't forget that you can show your support for the After the Collapse series by liking, commenting, and sharing these videos on other social media platforms. Enjoy the video. Alright, so now that spring is here, I've started jogging once again a lot, and it's usually at night when all the kids are asleep, and I find myself always assessing and surveying what's available in the environment, and I always make a habit of trying to take a different route every time I go for a jog. Because you want to know your neighborhood through and through. You want to know what's available. You want to know where certain resources might be located, who might be problematic in your neighborhood, and of course all the back roads and places of egress in case you ever did actually have to bug out. So I've broken down the results of what I discovered into 10 broad categories. It's actually a lot more than 10 things. It's just that I like the number 10. And so I had to pool a few things together in order to get that number. It's really a lot more than that. So let's just jump right in here. So number 10 is what I call the public to private ethical principle. And what this means basically is that there's an abundance of public property, stuff that was made by your tax dollars, be it municipal, provincial, or federal, that's available in the urban landscape for the taking when the getting gets bad. The thing is, who's going to take it first? Now, I want to say from the get-go that I don't condone any illegal activity whatsoever. I can't be held accountable whether in a grid up or grid down situation. You're going to have to use your discretion and potentially face the consequences for your actions were you to violate, utilize, or consume anything that's available in the public space. That said, it's far more ethical, I think, to take from the public space than it would be the private space, unless we're talking about resources that are in the public sphere that are being allocated to people who perhaps didn't prepare. And that's another thing I should mention, that obviously as preppers we should already have a lot of this stuff, but if you know that it's going to be grid down indefinitely, and it doesn't matter how much stuff you've prepped, you're going to have to be thinking long term and get proactive on some of the stuff I'm going to talk about. So the public-private principle is very simple. It's more ethical to take from the public sphere than it is the private, because privately owned stuff is, it's basically stealing, right? And it is stealing to some extent when you're talking about, taking things that are owned by public tax dollars. However, in that instance, it's you or somebody else. It's not like you're stealing directly from one person. You're kind of stealing from everybody, but the fact is that that's going to be gobbled up by somebody, so why not be you? So what I'm talking about here is any sort of bureaucratic institution, any sort of building which is funded by tax dollars. I mean, say for example that shit really hit the fan in a bad way and police stations, fire stations, schools, and government buildings were evacuated entirely. There might be a lot of useful resources within those places that you might want to tap first without having it affect your ethics and morality. I mean, after that, if you want to break off into the corporate sector, into the Walmarts and all the rest, then that's fine. But as I'm going to talk about next, that may not be the best course of action if you decided to anyways. Number 9 is the principle of going to the root of the supply chain. So this means not just focusing on all the low-hanging fruit first, but going for the high-hanging fruit. And if you look at any supply chain, basically it goes from raw materials to production and manufacturing to warehouses and distribution, including supply trucks, which a lot of people are going to overlook. And then finally it goes to retailers, which is where you see the bulk of the looting in a grid down situation. So you always see it in the storefronts, the big box stores and all the rest. That's where people are scrambling for stuff. When the reality is there's a lot more stuff that preceded that in the process of the supply chain. So going for the warehouses, distribution centers, and some of those supply trucks, even trains with shipping containers might be carrying useful commodities that you could put to use for survival purposes. Going even further up the process, you can even look into some of the production and manufacturing sectors. So those are the places that are making the bread, that are processing all the meat, basically taking raw materials and converting it into stuff before it goes to the warehouse and distribution center. Now, the need to exploit this may not come up until obviously all the warehouses and distribution centers have been exhausted as well. But what you want to do is get the jump on this stuff, so while people are looting the Walmarts and whatnot, granted that the government or powers that be don't already have the warehouses and distribution centers on lockdown, which they very well may, because I'm pretty sure they have contingency plans to preserve a lot of the vital infrastructure. But in such case that they leave a few of those places unguarded, that would be your opportunity to get that. And then when everybody finally starts to go for that high-hanging fruit and starts to raid these places in mass amounts, that's when you want to be thinking even further back in the supply chain towards the production and manufacturing aspect, and then even way back to the raw materials aspect. All right, number 8 is going to be exploiting construction sites. Now here you're probably going to be infringing on some private property, so you're going to have to manage the consequences of that if you did get caught. It may go against your own conscience to do so, but construction sites can be a bounty of all the various tools and raw materials you might need to reinforce your own domain that you may want to harden for the coming SHTF storm of deprived and desperate individuals. In these places, there may well be heavy machinery also that still has fuel in the tank, enough perhaps to do a bit of serious work. Getting that from point A to point B, of course, is another issue altogether, but in the very least, these machines will be great sources for fuel, and not many people are going to think to tap these. People are going to be tapping cars, they're not going to be thinking about all the big toys, and even a lot of the semi-trucks, for that matter, will be overlooked, simply because people will be so fixated on the idea of siphoning gas from a car that they won't be able to imagine anything else. Another thing you can get at construction sites is generators and possibly some kind of fuel source as well. So if the shit goes down tomorrow and you know of some major construction products in your area, put those on the Doomsday resource map. Now there's a lot of different things that are available in an urban environment that you can use for the purpose of creating some sort of barricade to perhaps block a street off so that you can funnel people into a different direction. And people are prone to taking the path of least resistance. It's just something that people normally do, and you could perhaps even disguise it as though it's not a barricade. You can make it look like just a natural barricade, like, you know, it was something that just happened, like get a few cars that got no gas left in the tank and move them into position. If you wanted to do something more obvious, of course, you could use things like garbage cans. You could fill those garbage cans with stuff so they can't be easily moved or pulled away by a truck. Another thing that I've thought of recently is that you can actually use things like street lights, trees, basically just cut them down or take the bolts out of the street lights, push them down on the street. That's going to create, you know, like a 1-foot barrier that lots of vehicles with lower clearance aren't going to be able to get over, at least not easily, without doing some damage to their suspension anyways. And if you down a lot of those street lights and a lot of those trees and whatever you can imagine, you know, even just power line poles and stuff like that, and that would at least impede people's entry into your space. I was thinking that you could even use power lines to some degree to sabotage. You could also use sandbags and the parking curbs if you can find a way to move them into position. Now, I would invite you to consider the reinforced garbage can as a possible pillbox or fortified defensive position in the urban landscape. The great thing about these, I'm sure you could rig up some sort of dolly-like system to move them from here to there wherever you wanted them, perhaps at the entry points or choke points of certain areas that you were trying to defend. So a reinforced steel garbage can, perhaps with some sandbags in there, something like that to stop the higher caliber rounds, could very well make for a great little ground level defensive position. Now, in terms of what kind of building would be easiest to defend in a without rule of law urban environment, let's take a look at Fort Knox. So Fort Knox, basically, they have a line of sight out for, I think, at least a mile, probably a lot more than that actually. You know, it's a pretty open space and there's no big fences and stuff like that. It's just an open space that you can see for a long distance, so you can see if people are coming. You definitely don't want to situate yourself in the midst of very tall buildings or other obstructions that people could hide in and come and get you. Like, take for instance Alexandria. From a logistical standpoint, you know, there's so many places that they could be invaded because of all the trees even though they have tall lookout towers, the trees basically provide invaders concealment. Something like that would not be good. Now, if you think about places like Walmarts and a lot of those suburban big box stores, they would kind of be ideal for this situation. For one, if you ever looked at a Walmart, there's not a whole lot of windows on it. This is mainly because it costs money to put windows in, and why have windows where you don't need them? Also, if you look at a lot of industrial buildings, it's mostly just those big garage doors, maybe a few odd windows in the office space. Those would be very easy to defend too. And also because you can see for a long distance, it's not surrounded by a lot of tall buildings, and typically in industrial areas, there's not a lot of tall trees to obstruct your view also. So that's something to keep in mind, is that no windows, and also things that are made of concrete, brick, mortar, steel, things that are going to be by and large flame proof, so that if you were bombarded with Molotov cocktails or something to that effect, that you wouldn't get lit up and you could stay in there, would have that capability to defend. Now, in terms of fortifying just something like a house, you could look into, of course, sandbags. I'm also thinking you could take the lids off those big metallic dumpsters. I'm not sure if they use them where you are, but in Canada we still have some garbage cans like that, although they're slowly being phased out. But you could take those, and those might provide some protection from a small bore, definitely. I'm not sure about a large bore rifle, probably not, but they will provide you some protection. So, you could probably reinforce some areas of your space with that if you had to. Basically anything metal that you can get your hands on, like there's all sorts of signs, like big signs around the city. Those are just big sheets of metal. If you put a few of those back to back, that might give you some ballistic protection. Don't quote me on that. I know that Civil Advantage did a test once with shipping containers, and he found that he was able to pierce one end of a shipping container with 5.56, I do believe, but it didn't go through two sides. So if you could maybe reinforce that, then you might have a chance of sustaining some fire and getting away with it. Another venue you might want to consider is an underground parkade. This could be your castle keep, so to speak. And the thing with a parkade, once again, of course, a lot of parkades are downtown, unfortunately, or in hospitals or places where there's a lot of traffic. So you might not be able to have all the trappings of a good position to fortify, but it would be a good place to keep your most vital assets. Usually there's only a couple ways in and a couple ways out. There's absolutely no windows, and it's built to resist a lot of damage. So underground parkade would definitely be something worth considering. One last strategy that I'm going to include in this category is something I've heard on many occasions before, and that's that you can use the railroad tracks in most cities as a way to bug out if the roads are clogged, because typically railroad tracks are without obstructions, of course, not the ones that are going over city streets. But in a lot of cases, especially if you have a 4x4 vehicle, you could probably drive for a significant length of time on a railroad track. What's more is that a lot of these railroad tracks are probably going to lead to some sort of distribution hub. Of course, trains carry a lot of cargo, so it's another potential place to find all manner of supplies, because trains not only haul processed goods, they also haul non-processed raw materials. But just make sure if you see signs that say terminus on them, you probably want to turn around and go back the other way. Alright, so stay tuned for part 2 of Urban Survival Strategies, and don't forget to get your entry in for the Apollo Tactical Bow System. I will post a link here and in the description. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out. Check out the Canadian Preppers Network blog, an excellent resource for survivalists and preppers.